The crystal spires of Kepler 442b caught the dying light of their sun, turning the entire city into a rainbow of fear. Ambassador Vextar stood at the edge of the great platform, his transparent body flickering with patterns of deep blue and purple. Those colors meant despair in his people's language, and today they burned brighter than ever before. His home star was dying. The scientists had been certain for months now. Their sun would collapse into a white dwarf within 18 months, taking their beautiful world with it. 47 million Zilani lived on this planet, and they had nowhere to go. The Zilani had never been fighters. For thousands of years they had lived in peace, building their cities from living crystal that grew like plants toward the sky. They shared their knowledge freely with other species, teaching them how to purify water and how to grow food in places where nothing should live. They asked for nothing in return except friendship. Now they needed help, and Vextar had to beg for it. The transport ship to the Galactic Council Station felt cold and empty. Vextar sat alone in the passenger area, watching the stars through the small window. Each point of light reminded him that somewhere out there lived billions of beings who might help his people, or might not. The council chamber was enormous, built to hold representatives from hundreds of different worlds. Vextar had been here many times before, usually to offer help to others. Today he stood in the center of the room, looking up at the curved walls where the most powerful species in the galaxy sat in judgment. Honored council members, Vextar began, his voice carrying clearly through the translation devices. My people face extinction. Our star dies, and we have no ships capable of moving our population to safety. We have served this council faithfully for 800 years. We ask now for your aid. The silence that followed felt like a physical weight pressing down on him. Finally, High Commander Zal of the Altarian Empire spoke. His voice was cold and mechanical through the translator. The Altarian fleets are committed to expansion into the Outer Rim territories. We cannot spare vessels for evacuation duties. The Corvin Federation representative, a being that looked like a walking tree made of metal, rustled his leaves in what Vextar knew was their version of a dismissive shrug. Resource allocation priorities prevent the Federation from engaging in charitable operations at this time. One by one, the great powers of the galaxy offered their excuses. The hegemony claimed budget constraints. The Star Alliance cited security concerns. The Trade Consortium spoke of profit margins and return on investment. Vextar felt his bioluminescent patterns growing dimmer with each rejection. Please, he said, and his voice cracked despite the translator's attempt to smooth it out. We are not asking for charity. The Zilani have contributed more scientific advances to galactic civilization than any other single species. Our water purification systems feed billions. Our agricultural techniques have ended famines on dozens of worlds. Surely this service has earned us the right to ask for help when we face extinction. Your contributions are acknowledged, said the Nexus Collective speaker, a being that appeared to be made entirely of shifting light. However, your pacifist philosophy makes you strategically irrelevant. The collective must prioritize species that can contribute to galactic security. We heal worlds, Vextar said, his patterns now flashing angry reds and oranges. We feed the hungry. We share our knowledge freely. Is this not valuable? Not valuable enough, came the reply from somewhere in the upper galleries. Vextar watched, in growing horror as the representatives began to file out of the chamber. These beings who had benefited from Zilani science for centuries were simply walking away. His people would die, and the galaxy would continue as if nothing had happened. From the Human Observer section, Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison watched the abandonment with growing anger. The stocky officer had brown hair and kind eyes that were now hard with fury. He had been to Zilani worlds before, had seen their beautiful cities and met their gentle people. The humans were new to galactic politics, observers only, but Morrison could not sit quietly and watch this happen. Beside him, Chief Engineer Lisa Park gripped the armrest of her chair so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She was a Small woman with black hair and hands that were always stained with engine grease. But she had one of the sharpest minds in the human fleet. Right now she was using some very sharp words to describe what she thought of the Council's decision. "This is wrong," she whispered to Morrison. "Dead wrong." "I know," Morrison replied, watching as the last of the major power representatives left the chamber. Only a few minor species remained, along with the humans and some others that most of the galaxy considered unimportant. Vextar stood alone in the center of the great chamber, his light patterns now so dim they were barely visible. He had traveled across the galaxy to beg for his people's lives, and he had been turned away by every species that had the power to help. Morrison stood up from his observer seat and walked down to the chamber floor. The sound of his boots echoed in the nearly empty space. When he reached Vextar, the Zilani ambassador looked up at him with eyes like pale diamonds. "Ambassador," Morrison said quietly, "humanity hears your call." Vextar's patterns flickered with surprise. "Your species has observer status only. You have no authority to offer aid." "Maybe not officially," Morrison replied, "but humans don't always wait for official permission to do the right thing." Behind them, Lisa Park was already working on her portable computer, sending messages to every human ship in the sector. Other observers from minor species were making similar calls. Word was spreading through communication networks that the major powers of the galaxy had missed. The Great Council chamber emptied completely, leaving only Vextar and the humans. The Zilani ambassador looked at these strange beings who had only recently discovered faster-than-light travel, who had no great fleets or vast territories. "Why would you help us?" he asked. "What do you gain?" Morrison thought about that for a moment. "My grandmother used to say that you measure a person not by how they treat those who can help them, but by how they treat those who can't. Same goes for species, I guess. But we truly cannot help you," Vextar said. "We have no military, no great wealth to offer in trade." "You've got something better," Lisa Park said, joining them on the chamber floor. "You've got a reputation for being decent people. That's worth more than fleets or money." Vextar's patterns began to brighten slightly, showing the first hope he had felt in months. "You would truly try to help us?" "We'll do more than try," Morrison said. "Give us the details. How many people, what kind of ships they can travel in, where they can be taken. We'll figure out the rest." As they talked, neither the humans nor Vextar noticed the small recording device that had been left behind in the chamber. News of humanity's promise to help the abandoned Zilani would spread quickly through the galaxy's communication networks. Some would call the humans fools for attempting an impossible rescue. Others would see something different. A young species that still remembered what the older civilizations had forgotten. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply answer when someone calls for help. The dying light of Kepler 442b's sun would shine for 18 more months. It remained to be seen whether that would be enough time for the outcasts and the desperate to accomplish what the mighty had refused to even attempt. Captain Ben Sullivan was hauling mining equipment to the outer rim when the message reached his ship. The old cargo vessel New Horizon shuddered as it dropped out of faster-than-light travel, and Sullivan read the transmission with growing anger. His weathered face, marked by 40 years of space travel, grew darker with each word. The message was simple. The Zilani needed help. The big powers had said no. Humans were asking for volunteers. Sullivan had met Zilani before, during a supply run to one of their research stations. They had been kind to him, sharing their knowledge about engine modifications that had saved him thousands of credits in fuel costs. They never asked for payment. They just wanted to help. Change course meant, he told his navigator, a young woman named Carol who had been with his crew for 3 years. "We're going to Zilani space." "Sir, we've got a contract to fulfill," Carol said, looking at the cargo manifest on her screen. "The mining company can wait," Sullivan replied. "Some things are more important than contracts." Across the galaxy, similar conversations were happening on dozens of human ships. Word spread through the networks that connected independent traders, cargo haulers, and passenger ships. The message was always the same. Good people needed help, and the powerful had turned their backs. In the dark space between star systems, something else stirred. The Kethmori had been listening to galactic communications for decades, even though most species pretended they did not exist. The insectoid race had been cast out from civilized space long ago, called monsters and parasites by those who feared their hive mind structure. Queen Mind Zakath received the message through her warrior drone, a creature the size of a small building with 4 powerful arms and compound eyes that could see in 17 different spectrums. The drone stood in the bioship's control chamber, its chittering voice translating the human transmission into the musical language of the hive. The Kethmori remembered the Zilani. When the hive ships had been driven from the inner systems, dying of thirst in the void, it was the Zilani who had shared water purification technology. They had asked for nothing in return, treating the feared insectoids as equals deserving of life. Prepare the bioships, Zakath commanded through the neural link that connected all her people. The debt will be repaid. Dr. Amanda Cross was studying alien plant samples on a remote research station when the emergency broadcast started coming through. The tall scientist with red hair had dedicated her life to understanding other species, learning their languages and customs. She knew immediately that this was bigger than just one rescue mission. Amanda started making calls. She contacted every independent captain she knew, every trader who valued honor over profit, every person who might have a ship and the courage to use it. Her list was longer than she had expected. The first ships began arriving in Zilani space. Within days, Captain Ryan Torres brought his modified freighter Liberty Bell, its cargo holds converted to carry passengers. Sam and Nancy Wright arrived in their family transport, a small ship that could barely make the journey but had come anyway. Behind them came others, a growing fleet of vessels that had no business attempting a rescue of this size. The Galactic Council watched these developments with alarm. Emergency sessions were called. Threats were made. The Altarian High Command issued warnings about unauthorized operations in Zilani territory. The Corvin Federation began preparing trade sanctions against any nation that supported the rescue effort. None of it mattered. The ships kept coming. Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the human survey ship Explorer, watching his sensors as more vessels dropped out of faster-than-light travel. Each new arrival brought cheers from the bridge crew. Lisa Park worked frantically at her engineering station, trying to coordinate docking schedules and supply transfers for ships that were never designed to work together. "How many do we have now?" Morrison asked. 43 human vessels, Park replied, checking her screens. "And something else is coming. Big signatures on the edge of the system." The Kethmori bioships emerged from hyperspace like living nightmares. Each vessel was grown rather than built, their organic hulls pulsing with internal light. They moved with fluid grace that made human ships look clumsy by comparison. To most galactic species, the sight of Kethmori war forms was enough to send them fleeing. The humans moved closer to get a better look. "Those are beautiful," whispered Carol from the New Horizon. She was staring at the largest bioship, a creature over 2 kilometers long that looked like a cross between a whale and a flower. "They're also terrifying," added Sam Wright. But his voice held admiration rather than fear. The first communication from the Kethmori came as a series of musical tones that the translation computers struggled to process. Finally, a message came through in broken but understandable galactic standard. "We come to help Crystal Light people. Debt must be paid." Ambassador Vextar, who had been coordinating with the human fleet from his homeworld, felt his bioluminescent patterns brighten with amazement. The Kethmori were among the most feared species in the galaxy, but here they were, offering aid to his dying people. More ships continued to arrive. Dr. Cross brought a converted research vessel loaded with medical supplies. Captain Torres was followed by his brother Miguel in an old passenger liner. The Wright family was joined by Nancy's sister and her husband, both flying cargo haulers that had seen better decades. But it was not just humans in Kethmori. Word of the rescue effort had spread through the networks used by minor species, the forgotten peoples who lived on the edges of galactic civilization. The aquatic Mertani sent a water processing ship. A group of silicon-based Christek arrived with energy storage equipment. Even individual members of major species began defecting from their government's positions, bringing whatever ships they could steal or buy. The rescue fleet grew larger each day, but it was still not enough. 47 million Zilani needed transportation, and the assembled ships could carry perhaps 2 million at most. The numbers did not work. That was when Lisa Park made a discovery that changed everything. She had been working with a Kethmori engineer, trying to understand how their bioships functioned. The insectoid, who called itself Tsikhar, had been surprisingly helpful despite the language barriers. "Your ships grow," Park said during one of their communication sessions. "They actually grow larger?" "Bioships adapt," Tsikhar replied through the translation system. "Need more space, grow more space, need more speed, grow more engines, is normal." Park stared at her screen, her mind racing. What if we could grow passenger compartments, temporary ones just for the evacuation? "Possible," the Kethmori replied, "but need framework, need structure to guide growth." "We can build frameworks," Park said excitedly. "That's what humans do best. We build things." The idea spread through the fleet like wildfire. Human engineers began working with Kethmori biotechnicians, sharing designs and concepts. The Zilani contributed their own crystal-growing techniques, creating living computer systems that could coordinate the hybrid vessels. Within a week, the first experimental ship was ready for testing. Captain Sullivan's New Horizon had been chosen for the conversion, and he watched in amazement as Kethmori growth pods sprouted from his hull like flowers blooming in fast motion. Zilani crystal matrices wove through the new structures, creating life support systems that pulsed with their own inner light. "It's alive," Sullivan whispered, watching his ship transform into something that had never existed before. The hybrid vessel could carry 10 times its original passenger load. More importantly, it proved that 3 completely different species could work together to create something none of them could build alone. The Galactic Council's response was swift and angry. Battle fleets began moving towards Zilani space. Trade embargoes were declared. Diplomatic protests flooded the communication networks, but in the outer rim, in the forgotten corners of space where outcasts and independents made their homes, the call for help had been heard. Ships continued to arrive, bringing supplies, personnel, and most importantly, hope. The rescue of the Zilani had become something larger than anyone had expected. It was becoming a statement that compassion could overcome politics, that the forgotten could achieve what the mighty would not even attempt. Time was running short, but for the first time since their sun began dying, the Zilani dared to believe they might survive. The dying sun of Kepler 442b was getting angry. Solar flares burst from its surface like giant whips of fire, sending deadly radiation across the star system. Any ship caught in the open during one of these flares would be cooked in seconds. Chief Medical Officer Kate Phillips stood in the medical bay of the hospital ship Mercy, watching the radiation monitors with growing concern. The blonde doctor had converted an old passenger liner into a floating hospital, but even with the best shielding available, the ship could not survive a direct hit from the solar storms. "We need better protection," she told Tony Garcia, a young engineer who had been working with the Kethmori bioships. The enthusiastic man with oil-stained coveralls had become the unofficial translator between human and alien technology. "The bug ships have some kind of natural shielding," Garcia said, using the nickname the humans had given the Kethmori. "Their hulls actually absorb radiation and convert it to energy." Kate looked out the window at the nearest bioship, a massive creature that pulsed with soft green light. "Can we copy that?" "Better than that," Garcia grinned. "We can grow it." The first hybrid conversion had been a success, but the radiation problem was getting worse each day. The Zilani star was becoming unpredictable, throwing out bursts of energy that could destroy any normal ship. The rescue fleet needed protection, and they needed it fast. Commander Steve Walsh led a squadron of fighters that were trying to provide early warning for the solar flares. The lean pilot with steady hands flew patrol routes that took him dangerously close to the star's outer atmosphere. His ship's sensors could detect the magnetic buildups that preceded each flare, giving the evacuation ships precious minutes to find shelter. "Another big one coming," Walsh radioed to the fleet as his instruments screamed warnings. All ships to safe distance. This one's going to be massive. The evacuation ships scattered like leaves in a windstorm, racing to get behind the planet or asteroids that could block the deadly radiation. But some of the hybrid vessels did something different. Instead of running, they turned toward the flare and absorbed it. Captain Helen Brooks watched in amazement from the bridge of her converted cargo hauler Big Sky. The Kethmori biopods that had grown from her hull were glowing brighter with each wave of radiation that hit them. Her ship's power systems were actually gaining energy from the solar storm. "This is impossible," she muttered, but the readings on her screens were clear. The bioorganic shielding was not just protecting her ship, it was feeding it. Garcia's voice came over the communication system, barely able to contain his excitement. "The crystal matrices are working as amplifiers. The Zelani tech is boosting the bioabsorption by 300%. We're not just surviving the flares, we're using them as fuel." The breakthrough changed everything. Within days, every human ship in the fleet was being converted with bioorganic shielding. The process was strange to watch. Kethmori worker drones, each the size of a small car, would attach themselves to human hulls and begin secreting a living metal that hardened into protective shells. Zelani crystal systems grew through these shells like glowing veins, creating networks that could process energy and information. Dr. Amanda Cross documented the entire process from her research vessel. The red-haired scientist could hardly believe what she was seeing. 3 completely different technologies were merging into something that should not have been possible. "The biometal from the Kethmori provides the base structure," she recorded in her notes. "Human engineering gives it framework and direction. Zelani crystals add intelligence and energy processing. Each system enhances the others. But the conversions took time, and time was running short. The Zelani had less than 6 months before their world became completely uninhabitable. Even with the hybrid ships, the rescue fleet could only evacuate about half the population. That was when Captain Ryan Torres made a suggestion that sounded crazy but might work. He was sitting in a meeting aboard Vextar's coordination ship, looking at charts that showed evacuation schedules and population numbers. "What if we don't just evacuate people?" Torres asked. "What if we evacuate cities?" The room fell silent. Vextar's bioluminescent patterns flickered with confusion. "I do not understand." "Your cities are made of living crystal, right?" Torres continued. "They grow like plants. What if we could transplant them to other worlds?" A Kethmori engineer, named Zikti, who had been working with the human teams, chittered with what sounded like excitement. The translation came through a moment later. "Bioships can carry living structures. Have done this before with hive colonies. The idea was revolutionary. Instead of just moving people, they could move entire communities. Zelani cities could be carefully removed from their dying world and replanted on new planets. The living crystal would adapt to new environments, creating homes that were truly alive, but the process would require perfect coordination between all 3 species. Human ships would provide the transport frameworks. Kethmori biotechnology would keep the crystal cities alive during the journey. Zelani expertise would guide the replanting process. The first test involved a small research station on one of Kepler 442b's moons. The building was a simple structure, only about the size of a human house, but it was fully alive and integrated with Zelani technology. Captain Sullivan's converted New Horizon carefully approached the moon. Biopods extended from the ship like giant hands gently grasping the crystal structure. The building's surface began to glow as it connected with the ship's biosystems. "It's working," Garcia reported from the engineering station. "The crystal is interfacing with our biosystems. The whole structure is going dormant for transport." The building seemed to melt into the ship's hull, becoming part of the vessel's living structure. Hours later, they tested the reverse process. On a barren asteroid, the crystal structure flowed out of the ship and began to rebuild itself, adapting to its new environment. "Incredible," whispered Dr. Cross. "The crystal is reading the asteroid's mineral composition and adjusting its growth patterns accordingly." Word of the successful test spread through the fleet. If they could evacuate entire cities, They could save not just the Zilani people, but their entire civilization. Their art, their history, their way of life could all be preserved. But the Galactic Council was watching too, and they did not like what they saw. The success of the human Kethmori alliance was making the major powers look weak and uncaring. Worse, other minor species were beginning to ask why they needed the Council at all if outcasts and primitives could accomplish such miracles. Admiral Korath of the Altarian battle fleet received orders that were clear and direct. The evacuation must be stopped. If the rescue succeeded, it would undermine the authority of every major power in the galaxy. The example of cooperation between humans, Kethmori, and Zilani could not be allowed to spread. Deploy the fleet to Zilani space, Korath ordered his subordinates. Prepare for enforcement action. As the rescue fleet worked desperately to save an entire civilization, massive warships began moving through hyperspace toward them. The Galactic Council had decided that some examples were too dangerous to allow. The hybrid ships continued their work, growing stronger and more efficient with each passing day. Human ingenuity, Kethmori biotechnology, and Zilani crystal science were creating vessels that surpassed anything the galaxy had ever seen. But would it be enough to stand against the might of the established powers? Time was running out, and the dying star was not the only threat the rescue fleet would have to face. The Altarian warfleet dropped out of hyperspace like a pack of hunting wolves. 50 massive battlecruisers arranged themselves in attack formation around the Zilani system, their weapons powered and ready. Admiral Korath stood on the bridge of his flagship, looking at the scattered rescue ships with disgust. "Signal the illegal fleet," he ordered his communications officer. "Tell them they have 1 hour to cease operations and leave Zilani space. Any ship that refuses will be destroyed." The message reached Admiral Patricia Stone aboard the human escort ship Defender. The gray-haired veteran had commanded warships for 30 years, but she had never faced odds like these. Her entire force consisted of 12 lightly armed patrol vessels against 50 of the most powerful warships in the galaxy. "Ma'am, what are your orders?" asked her tactical officer, a young lieutenant named Dave who looked nervous but determined. Stone looked at the display showing all the rescue ships scattered throughout the system, hundreds of vessels filled with Zilani refugees, hybrid bioships that represented the hope of 3 species working together, and brave crews who had risked everything to answer a call for help. "Open a channel to all ships," she said quietly. Her voice carried across every frequency used by the fleet. "This is Admiral Stone to all vessels. We came here to save lives. We're not leaving until the job is done." The response from the rescue fleet was immediate. Captain Sullivan's voice came through first. "The New Horizon stands with you, Admiral." "Big Sky isn't going anywhere," added Captain Brooks. One by one, every ship in the fleet acknowledged the message. Human cargo haulers, Kethmori bioships, converted passenger liners, and hybrid vessels that had never existed before in galactic history. All of them chose to stay. Admiral Korath received the defiant response with cold anger. "Begin enforcement action. Target the largest rescue vessels." First, the Altarian battlecruisers moved forward, their massive hulls bristling with weapons designed to destroy entire fleets. Behind them came Corvin Federation ships, sleek vessels that looked like flying knives. The combined force was enough to conquer most star systems. But as they approached the rescue fleet, something unexpected happened. The Kethmori bioships began to change. Their organic hulls shifted and flowed, releasing clouds of metallic particles that spread through space, like glowing fog. Queen Minzact communicated through her warrior drone to all ships in the area. Her voice was calm but carried the weight of absolute determination. "Your weapons cannot penetrate organic metal designed to survive in stellar cores. We will protect those who protect the innocent." The metallic clouds began to form barriers between the war fleet and the rescue ships. The particles, each one a living organism, linked together to create shields that pulsed with bioelectric energy. The barriers were beautiful, like curtains of liquid starlight, but they were also incredibly strong. Admiral Korath ordered his ships to fire warning shots, energy beams that could have destroyed normal vessels. The beams struck the biometal, Barriers and simply disappeared, absorbed and converted into harmless light. Impossible, Korath muttered, staring at his tactical displays. Nothing can absorb directed energy weapons like that. On the rescue ships, Tony Garcia was watching, his instruments with amazement. The biometal isn't just blocking the weapons, he reported to Captain Torres. It's learning from them. Each shot makes the barriers stronger. The standoff might have continued for hours, but then disaster struck. Captain Pete Johnson's evacuation shuttle, loaded with Zilani children from a remote settlement, suffered a critical engine failure while returning to the fleet. The small vessel began to drift helplessly toward the dying star's radiation field. "Mayday, Mayday," Johnson's voice crackled over the radio. "Engines are dead. We're falling into the radiation zone." The shuttle carried 200 young Zilani, their crystal bodies flickering with fear patterns. They had less than 10 minutes before the radiation would kill them all. Every ship in the rescue fleet tried to respond, but the Altarian battle, cruisers blocked their path. Admiral Korath had positioned his forces to prevent any rescue attempt. "Let them through," Admiral Stone radioed to the Altarian commander. "Those are children." "The evacuation is illegal," Korath replied coldly. "We cannot allow it to continue." That was when something remarkable happened. Commander Steve Walsh, flying patrol in his small fighter, broke formation and headed straight for the shuttle. Behind him came 3 other human pilots, their tiny ships racing through space toward certain death. "Walsh, get back here," Stone ordered. "Your fighters can't survive in that radiation field." "Can't leave kids to die, Admiral," Walsh replied, his voice steady despite the odds. "It's not who we are." The Altarian ships targeted the fighters, but before they could fire, the Kethmori bioships moved. Massive organic vessels placed themselves between the fighters and the battlecruisers, their hulls absorbing the energy weapons without damage. Walsh's fighter reached the shuttle just as its hull began to glow from radiation exposure. Using his ship's tractor beam, he tried to pull the larger vessel away from the star, but his small craft did not have enough power. Then Captain Sullivan arrived in the New Horizon, followed by Torres in the Liberty Bell. The 2 cargo ships linked, their tractor beams with Walsh's fighter, all 3 vessels straining against the star's gravity. "We're not strong enough," Sullivan reported, his ship's hull beginning to heat up from the radiation. That was when the bioships acted. Zichthi's vessel, a massive creature over a kilometer long, flowed around the shuttle like liquid metal. Biopods extended to grasp the damaged ship, while organic shielding spread to protect all the rescue vessels from the deadly radiation. The combined effort pulled the shuttle to safety, just as its hull would have failed. 200 young Zilani were saved by the cooperation of beings who had never worked together before. The rescue was broadcast across every communication channel in the system. The image of human fighters, cargo ships, and alien biovessels working desperately together to save children spread throughout the galaxy's networks. On worlds across the galaxy, people watched the footage in amazement. The mighty Altarian Empire, with all its power and weapons, had stood by and watched children drift toward death. The despised humans and the feared Kethmori had risked everything to save them. Public opinion began to shift like a tide turning. Protests erupted on Altarian worlds. Corvin Federation citizens demanded to know why their government was threatening rescue ships. Even members of the Galactic Council began to question their orders. Admiral Korath found himself facing a problem he had not expected. His own officers were beginning to refuse orders. Lieutenant Commander Vash, his second-in-command, approached him on the bridge. "Sir, my family is watching the news feeds. They want to know why we're stopping people from saving children." "We have our orders," Korath replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Orders to do what? Let refugees die? Stop people from showing compassion?" Around the system, the rescue operation continued. The hybrid ships worked faster than ever, their bioorganic systems adapting and improving with each evacuation run. Human crews worked alongside Kethmori drones, while Zilani crystal singers coordinated the massive effort through their living computer networks. The dying star continued to throw out radiation bursts, but the biometal shielding turned each attack into fuel for the rescue fleet. The ships were growing stronger, more efficient, more capable with each passing hour. Time was running short, but something had changed. The galaxy was watching, and for the first time in centuries, people were asking why the powerful were so determined to stop the compassionate. The rescue of the Zilani had become something larger than anyone had imagined. It was becoming a test of what galactic civilization truly meant. The Zilani star was dying faster than anyone had expected. What should have been months of gradual collapse was happening in weeks. The star's outer layers were being stripped away by massive solar winds, and the radiation was getting worse every day. Captain Rick Martinez watched the readings on his ship's sensors with growing alarm. The converted mining vessel Iron Will was leading the final evacuation wave. But time was running out. Nearly 2 million Zilani still waited on the planet's surface, and their cities were beginning to fail as the star's energy became too unstable to sustain the living crystal. "How long do we have?" Martinez asked his navigator, a woman named Beth who had been tracking the star's collapse for weeks. 6 hours, maybe 8, she replied, her voice tight with worry. "After that, the radiation will be too strong for any ship to survive in the inner system." Martinez looked at his screens showing the evacuation progress. The hybrid bioships were working at maximum capacity, their organic hulls stretched to the limit with passenger pods and Crystal City segments. But it was not enough. At their current rate, they would only save half the remaining population. Dr. Jennifer Walsh stood in the medical bay of a Keth Mori bioship, treating radiation sickness in 3 different species at once. The dedicated physician had learned to read the biosigns of humans, the crystal resonance patterns of Zilani, and the chemical markers that indicated illness in the insectoid Keth Mori. "We need more ships," she told Zikti, the Keth Mori engineer who had become her closest alien friend. "There are too many people and not enough space." The insectoid's compound eyes reflected the lights of the medical equipment as it processed her words. "Ships at maximum growth cannot expand further without structural failure." That was when Tony Garcia, monitoring the fleet communications from his engineering station, heard something that gave him hope. Ships were arriving at the edge of the Bidi system, but they were not Galactic Council reinforcements. "Admiral Stone," he called over the radio, "you need to see this." On the long-range sensors, dozens of new contacts were dropping out of hyperspace. But these were not warships. They were cargo haulers, passenger liners, mining vessels, and transport ships from across the galaxy. Ships belonging to minor species that had been inspired by the rescue effort. The first message came from a Mertani watership captain. "We heard the call. We came to help." Then a Christek mining vessel. "Our energy storage ships are at your disposal." One by one, vessels from species that the Galactic Council barely acknowledged announced their arrival. They had come from hundreds of light years away, risking their careers and their lives to join the rescue. Admiral Korath watched this development from his flagship with growing frustration. His orders had been clear: stop the evacuation and restore Council authority. But every hour that passed brought more ships to help the Zilani, and his own crews were becoming increasingly unwilling to fire on rescue vessels. "Sir," his communications officer reported, "we're receiving messages from across the galaxy. Citizens are demanding that we allow the evacuation to continue." On the planet's surface, Ambassador Vextar coordinated the final evacuation efforts from the capital city. The beautiful crystal spires that had stood for thousands of years were beginning to crack as the star's unstable energy overwhelmed their systems. "All remaining cities must be prepared for emergency extraction," he announced through the bio-crystal communication network. "The star will not give us more time." The evacuation had become a race against stellar death. Every minute counted, and the hybrid fleet was pushing beyond all safe limits. Bioships strained to carry loads that should have been impossible. Human crews worked without sleep, their bodies pushed to exhaustion. Zilani crystal singers maintained the communication networks even as their own cities crumbled around them. Then, disaster struck. The Morning Star, one of the largest evacuation ships, suffered a catastrophic failure in its bioorganic systems. The vessel, carrying 50,000 Zilani refugees, began to drift helplessly as its living hull started to die. Captain Helen Brooks, commanding the Big Sky, saw the crisis developing on her sensors. "We have to help them," she told her crew. "Ma'am, if we link with that ship, we might not be able to break free before the star goes critical," her engineer warned. Brooks looked at the thousands of life signs on her screen, then at the timer counting down to stellar collapse. "Then we better work fast." What happened next became the stuff of legend. Every ship in the rescue fleet, regardless of species or design, began linking together. Human tractor beams connected with Keth-Mori biocables. Zelani crystal networks spread between vessels, creating a communication web that spanned hundreds of kilometers. The Morning Star was pulled into the center of this improvised megastructure, its failing systems supported by the combined life energy of dozens of ships. Biopods flowed between vessels, redistributing passengers to prevent any single ship from being overloaded. Tony Garcia, working frantically at his engineering station, watched in amazement as the three species' technologies merged completely. "It's like they were meant to work together," he breathed. The linked fleet, now a single organism stretching across space, began its final escape from the dying system. Behind them, the Zelani homeworld's surface cracked and split as the stars' radiation overwhelmed the planet's protective magnetic field. But they were not alone. The newly arrived ships from minor species had formed their own rescue chains, pulling the last crystal cities and refugee groups away from the collapsing world. Admiral Korath faced a moment of choice. His superiors expected him to fire on the evacuation fleet to assert council authority even at the cost of millions of lives. But as he watched the incredible sight of hundreds of ships working together to save an entire civilization, he made a different decision. "Stand down weapons," he ordered quietly. "Let them go." Some of his officers looked surprised, but others nodded with relief. They had joined the military to protect people, not to prevent their rescue. The linked fleet jumped to hyperspace just as the Zelani star began its final collapse. The beautiful world that had been home to the Crystal Singers for millennia vanished in a burst of stellar fire, but its people and their living cities had been saved. In the months that followed, the rescued Zelani established new colonies on worlds provided by their rescuers. Their crystal cities took root in alien soil, adapting and growing in ways that amazed everyone who saw them. The rescue had changed the galaxy forever. The old Galactic Council, exposed as caring more about politics than lives, began to lose its authority. New alliances formed between species that had been ignored or outcast for centuries. Ambassador Vextar, now representing the Zelani Human Keth-Mori Alliance, delivered a message to what remained of the old council. "We cried for help, and you turned away. But those you called lesser heard our call and answered. The galaxy remembers who stood with the innocent when it mattered most." The age of the great powers was ending. In its place rose something new, a galaxy where compassion mattered more than strength, where cooperation created wonders that conquest never could. And in the space between the stars, hybrid ships continued to grow and evolve, carrying the dreams of species that had learned they were stronger together than they ever could be apart.